Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 95, Part 2, The Nelson Robbery. This episode is a continuance on the story of the Nelson Robbery, and it's going to cover the information on the other two men that were arrested and jailed as part of the crime. The third, James Duncan. James Duncan was born in London in 1824. He claimed to have arrived in Australia as a free man per the ship Lord Lyndoch in 1840. However, he was actually sentenced to 10 years transportation. His convict record lists that he's a stonemason, 5'6", light brown hair with grey eyes. He came to Victoria in 1851. He was living in the Keilor Plains Black Forest region of Victoria in the early 1850s, when apparently he received some training in bushranging with his accomplices James Morgan and John James. As a consequence of this association, he was involved in the gold robbery from the ship Nelson, and at this stage he was known as John Purcell. He had witnesses that claimed that he had been in a drunken stupor all night in a house in Little Bourke Street and had woken only when the chimney caught fire in the early hours of the morning. Duncan's prison record showed that he was anything but a model prisoner. There's a continuous account of offences and punishments. By late 1858, he must have decided he'd had enough of prison, and he kept his nose clean as he was released on the 27th of March 1860 on a ticket of leave to the Keilor district. However, on the 29th of February 1864, it was recorded in the paper that one of the men concerned in the famous Nelson gold robbery, named Purcell, otherwise Duncan, was brought before the City Court on the 23rd, charged with being illegally at large from the colony. The prisoner was sentenced in 1852 and in 1860 was allowed out on ticket of leave. Since that, he'd failed to report himself, and nothing was heard of him until lately when he was arrested in New South Wales and shipped to Melbourne. He was remanded pending the arrival of a report as to the character he had borne during his residence in New South Wales. He was found to be illegally at large on the 7th of March 1865 as well, and his ticket of leave was removed on the 16th of June 1865. Then on the 15th of September 1865, he was charged with burglary and stealing in the Supreme Court in Melbourne and sentenced to 4 years hard labour, with a minimum of 3 years and 10 months to be served. And it says Duncan, one of the 5 men, was arrested at Little River. I don't know how the police got wind of his movements, but Carmen, the detective, brought him down, and I identified him positively as the man who let off the pistol which shot me. This man at the trial attempted to prove an alibi. A very ingenious attempt it was. He produced a witness on his behalf, a leading medical man, a gentleman of very high standing, who testified on the night of the robbery that Duncan was attacked with very severe spasms, and the doctor attended him till close on 11 o'clock. At 3 o'clock the doctor was sent for again and was told the man was dying. He went and Duncan appeared to be dreadfully bad for 2 or 3 hours, whom he got quiet and the doctor left him. You see, it was nearly 1:30 in the morning when the robbers came on board, so between 11 and 3 Duncan had time to be with the gang, so his attempted alibi broke down and he was convicted with the rest. The fellow had been shamming illness and had actually deceived the doctor. Duncan did not serve all of his sentence. He turned Queen's evidence at the trial of the prisoners for the murder of Mr. Price, the Inspector General of Penal Departments, and was liberated afterwards. And on the 18th of September 1865... James Duncan pleaded not guilty to an indictment charging him with having on the 2nd of September feloniously broken into the dwelling house of John McIntyre and stolen 2 coats and a cash box, the property of Jonathan Wilkinson. The prisoner had some claim to reputation in his own line, for he was one of those concerned with the famous gold robbery of the Nelson. Mr. McIntyre was a manager of Mr. Wilkinson's draper's shop in King Street, the owner being absent in England. On the Saturday night in question, just about midnight, Mr. McIntyre locked up the place and left it for a while, in the company of Mr. William Daniel McNulty, his assistant. Besides the stock, they left behind them £22, 17 shillings and 8 pence in notes, gold and silver in a cash box. After an absence of a quarter of an hour, they returned and saw 2 men coming out of the house they had left. "They are robbers," said Mr. McIntyre, and he and Mr. McNulty ran after the men who ran away. One of the supposed robbers wore a white coat, and as they ran into Little Lonsdale Street, the pursuers heard the sound of money rattling in a box, apparently carried by the white-coated fugitive. Mr. McIntyre and his assistant followed the rattling noise, which suddenly stopped, as though the man carrying the box had thrown it away. At that point, the pursuers lost sight of the white coat and turned back to the place where they supposed the cash box to have been dropped. In doing so, they came on the prisoner, who was walking slowly. As he saw him, Mr. McIntyre cried out, "You are one of the robbers," and caught hold of him. The prisoner tried to escape and struck his captor, who, however, stuck to him manfully until they gave him in charge to Constable O'Brien. All parties went back to the shop, and it was found that 2 coats were missing. As they went from thence to the watch house, it was noticed that the prisoner wore one of the stolen coats. It still bore the distinguishing ticket by which it was identified. In the meantime, Constable Miller had been searching the lanes and rights of way near where the prisoner was caught, and there he found the stolen cash box. The defence was a denial of identity, and the verdict was guilty. His Honour mentioned that the prisoner had come out to this colony in bond and had also been sentenced to 15 years imprisonment with hard labour, the first 3 in irons, in concern with the Nelson gold robbery. The prisoner hoped all the circumstances about that case would be remembered. He had got out on a ticket of leave, and after a few days in Melbourne he'd gone away for 4 years. He was brought back, but owing to the excellent character he had brought back with him, he was only punished with 14 days imprisonment. After this he went to Queensland, and being once more brought back, his good character again procured him the light punishment of 14 days imprisonment. A 3rd time he got away and was brought back, but before he had time to acquire a fresh good character, consequently he was punished with 2 months imprisonment. He had not long been out of jail after that when he was taken under this charge, of which he was perfectly innocent. He now asked the judge not to send him to Pentridge, where he had enemies. His Honour did not see how he could choose a jail for the prisoner. The prisoner said, "Any other jail for the colony will do me, bar one, Your Honour." His Honour said, "I dare say they like you as little in Pentridge as you like them. I can only sentence you to 4 years in jail with hard labour." In June 1866, he was given 6 months in irons for attempting to escape. Despite more misbehaviour, he was finally released on the 3rd of February 1870. But once more he could not stay out of trouble, and after burgling a jeweller's shop in Bourke Street, he was sentenced on the 16th of May 1870 to 10 years on the roads. On the 7th of June 1870, he was sent to Pentridge to serve out his sentence, and he served 9 years, 9 months and 20 days. On the 21st of May 1870 in the criminal sessions on Wednesday, James Duncan, James Watson and Thomas Baxter were charged with breaking into the shop of William Anderson on the 4th of May and stealing a quantity of jewellery valued at £400. The premises was entered by forcing open the back gate of the Anthropological Museum. A piece of glass was cut out of the window of the lecture hall so that the catch might be withdrawn and the window opened. The thieves then went down to a small trapdoor made for the purpose of getting at the gas meters, made their way under the floor of the hall to a small pantry or cupboard at the back of Anderson's premises, and by breaking away some boards were able to get into the back room and hence into the shop. Baxter was arrested the same morning with all of the goods in his possession. He stated that he got them from Duncan and Watson, who were also arrested. The prisoners freely exercised their right of challenge, no less than 29 jurors being turned back. The jury, after retiring a few minutes, found Duncan and Watson guilty of burglary and Baxter guilty of receiving with a guilty knowledge. The prisoners had several previous convictions recorded against them, Duncan being convicted for the Nelson gold robbery and several cases of burglary and assault. And then another case says one of the 4 men, James Duncan, soon after his release, was arrested for stealing a cheap pair of blucher boots from the outside of a boot store and got a month for it. Within a few months of that, in the mid-60s, I saw him in the dock at the Criminal Supreme Court with a couple of others, standing his trial for a burglary at a jeweller's shop in Bourke Street near the Theatre Royal, and of that offence he was convicted and went back to Pentridge for 10 years, and it will be believed all this time he had something like £1,200 to his credit in one of the banks, the Colonial. The application was made by the police for this money, claiming it was the proceeds in the Nelson robbery, but the judge refused the application. He was not satisfied the money was the proceeds of the sale of the Nelson gold. The money had not been lodged there at the time. There being honour among thieves, it must have found its way to the bank, as the colonial was not established until 1856. So on the 17th of December 1870, he received 1 month for larceny under the name John Johnston, and it did state in his jar record that he was single and he had no relatives in the colony. And on the 17th of December 1875, aged 51, he died. And there was a mention in the paper, another celebrated character has departed this life. The district coroner held an inquest on Saturday at the Pentridge Stockade on the body of James Duncan, a prisoner of the Crown. The cause of death was rupture of an abscess of the liver. Duncan was connected with the most daring bands of highway robbers that once infested the colony. In 1862, he formed one of the party that robbed the ship Nelson in Hobsons Bay, and for this he was sentenced to 15 years. Duncan made a will in favour of a man named Lewis. The fourth, Stephen Fox, he was born in 1815 in Bristol, England. He arrived on the ship Brothers in 1838 and was placed upon a bond on his arrival. He was described as 5'10", with sandy hair and grey eyes upon his conviction for the robbery. On the 20th of April 1852, the Nelson Robbery, more apprehensions. The Portland Guardian stated that 2 men with more money than any fortunate gold diggers even are likely to be possessed of were apprehended in Portland on Wednesday under suspicion of being implicated with the Melbourne ship robbery. Their account of the way in which they acquired so much money does not appear to be at all satisfactory. One gave his name as Stephen Fox, on whose person was found the sum of £785, the other William Smith, who had in gold notes £535. The apprehension took place in a public house where they were anxiously awaiting a vessel for Adelaide. Every part of their apparel indicated something unnatural. Their clothes were new and unsuited to their station, their handkerchiefs without a hem, and on the line of road they came. They were apprehended by the clerk of the bench and the chief constable, and though armed and refusing to surrender until overpowered, they were secured without bloodshed and without unnecessary violence. They refused to give any account of themselves, remained sullen and uncommunicative, and the Portland Herald furnished the following particulars. 2 men, one styling himself Smith and the other Fox, were apprehended on Tuesday the 13th at the Tasmanian Inn on suspicion of being connected with the gang that daringly robbed the Nelson in Hobsons Bay. A gentleman who first eyed them on the jetty, displaying money to a great amount, as he imagined, mentioned the circumstance to the clerk of the bench, who instantly communicated to the police magistrate what he'd been told, and precautionary measures were adopted and prudential plans arranged whereby to make work of their capture. This done, Mr. Allison, accompanied by the chief constable, attended also by 3 other constables, repaired to Mr. Jones's. Mr. Allison entered first, followed by the chief, and found the suspected pair in the apartment which they entered. Mr. Allison at once called the men to surrender, at which language he appeared to be highly indignant, exclaiming he was a gentleman, and questioned his authority for being interfered. The assailant was inexorable, and after strong resistance, both belligerents were taken into custody. One had £750 in his possession, the other upwards of £500 in his possession, an aggregate upwards of £1,400 between the two. Only one of them was armed at the time, and that with a pistol crammed to the muzzle and mounted with a spring bayonet. Present appearances are indicative of their alliance with the Hobsons Bay piracy. The very fact of so much money being found on the persons leads to a very strong surmise of their guilt. Fox, as he calls himself, pretends to be either owner or overseer of Umarella Station, lately the property of Mr. Boyd. No document was found by him to give grounds for such a belief. A strong additional mark, most tantamount to guilt, is that when captured, their every movement exhibited great fear and nervous excitement. A report has induced us to think that their fortune did not cost them the sweat of their brow to acquire it. We mean the lavish manner in which they rewarded the groom at a certain inn on their way to Portland. The evidence as yet, though only circumstantial, bears in our mind a strong impressive probability. On the 1st of July 1852 at the Geelong Circuit Court, Stephen Fox, convicted last night of being concerned in the Nelson robbery, was placed at the bar to receive sentence. His Honour remarked that he had been found guilty on the clearest evidence of one of the most atrocious crimes committed in the annals of the colony, It certainly was very satisfactory that the power of the law has been exercised in punishing some of the associates in this diabolical and atrocious crime. He observed that the prisoner's case had met with calm and dispassionate consideration at the hands of the jury, and he perfectly agreed when the verdict was returned. The sentence of the court was that he be worked on the public roads in the colony for 15 years, the first 3 in irons. It seems that William Smith and Edward Wilson, who was also charged and kept on remand and questioned, were both acquitted. The evidence against Fox concluded beyond doubt, and Mr. Davis Swearington being one of the men who held the pistol to him and was the only one that he noticed with his face unmasked. So Stephen Fox spent most of his time on the prison hulks. He spent some time in Pentridge Prison, and he died on the 25th of November 1857 of fever at the Collingwood Stockade at the age of 42. And others that were suspected to be involved?
First was John Roberts. He was born in 1820 in England. He was a carpenter at the time of his conviction, 5 foot 6.5 inches, with light brown hair and grey eyes. He arrived on the ship Maitland in 1843 on a bond. John was initially convicted for his part in the Nelson Robbery, but he had his sentence remitted by the Lieutenant Governor on the 3rd of August 1852 after proving an alibi. Roberts had a string of witnesses to say that he was at Fry's Creek on the night of the robbery. The alibi set up by Roberts was proved by 2 carriers named Smith. They were brothers, and Roberts was on the road with them many miles from Melbourne when the Nelson was robbed. The Crown, represented by Mr. Stawell, the Attorney General, and Mr. Redmond Barry, the Solicitor General, thought that the brothers Smith had been suborned, and at the close of the trial they were arrested for perjury and committed for trial, but were admitted to bail, at great expense of conclusive evidence in support of their case, that they were immediately acquitted, and within 5 weeks Roberts was released. So his story was that on the night of the robbery he was at Bendigo engaging in a prize fight, and on his behalf a number of witnesses were called to prove what he said was true. They were a lot of blackguards and ruffians and disreputable persons that their evidence was not believed. So Roberts was convicted with the others and sentenced to 15 years, but in passing sentence the judge said that if at any time Roberts could satisfy the authorities of the truth of his story, he would be at once set at liberty. Within 6 months he did prove beyond doubt that he was at Bendigo fighting, and he was liberated, but in 3 months he was back again under sentence for 10 years for housebreaking, so the lawyers knew his character pretty well. So he was convicted of robbery under company at Buninyong, Victoria on the 30th of September 1853, and with the 10 years that he was sentenced, the first 2 were in irons. However, on the 10th of October 1853, so only a month after he was imprisoned, an article in the paper titled "Escape of a Prisoner." At the last sessions at Buninyong, 11 prisoners who had been convicted were ordered to be committed to the Geelong jail. Among the number of these was a notorious character of the name Roberts, who was tried and convicted for the Nelson gold robbery and sentenced to the roads. But some doubts arising in his case on the score of identity, the executive pardoned him. Since then he's been carrying on as much in the same way, robbery and violence, and was again sentenced at the sessions to 10 years on the roads. The officer in charge of the batch of prisoners halted for refreshments and rest at Ray's Hotel, late O'Meara's, on the Geelong Road, and the 11 prisoners were conducted into a room in which there was a large window 2 foot from the floor. At this place, Roberts, feigning a desire to write to one of the district magistrates, was allowed to have his right hand at liberty, and his companion on the left, who no doubt connived at his endeavours, gave the handcuff a slip. Roberts seized the opportunity and in an instant was through the window like lightning and has not since been heard of. It is worthy of remark that only one trooper was told to watch these 11 men whilst in the room, and that he did not fire his piece at the fugitive. Roberts' luck, however, was not in, as he ran into the arms of the foot constable, who had been recently stationed at this point, and he held Mr. Roberts until the pursuing constables came up. So he was sent back to Geelong Jail, and he had 6 months added to his sentence for attempting to abscond, and he was then sent to the Sulk, Sacramento, on the 5th of November 1853. He again escaped on the 20th of October 1854, and from that he was sentenced to 6 months hard labour on the roads to commence at the expiration of his former sentence. He was transferred to Pentridge in December 1856,
and then Collingwood on the 9th of July 1857 to work on the stockade. And Roberts died on the 25th of March 1858 from chronic dysentery while working on the Collingwood stockade. He was only 38. The second suspected was John Milton Dascombe, the publican that was mentioned earlier. So he was a St Kilda publican, and it was believed that he was the fencer of the stolen goods. So that is, he was the receiver or the mover of the gold, and he knowingly bought the gold to later resell at profit. John Dascombe was born in Somerset, England in July 1824. He was a 19-year-old cabinet maker from Bath, and he'd been found guilty of larceny from the person at the Somerset Assizes at Bridgewater on the 18th of August 1843. He was sentenced to transportation for 10 years and sailed to Port Phillip on the Stratheden, arriving in January 1846. Dascombe married Bridget Brown at St Francis Roman Catholic Church in Melbourne late in 1846. At the time of their marriage, he was only 21 and Bridget was 31. And in 1850, there was an ad for the Woolpack Inn saying, "Milton Dascombe begs most respectfully to announce his numerous friends and the public in general he's obtained the transfer of licence of the Woolpack Inn from Richard Barry. He solicits the patronage of bush friends and customers who have so liberally patronised him in former establishments for 5 years past, and he intends to continue the same private and good accommodation at the Woolpack Inn as he used to do in his former establishment. He hopes to receive a liberal share of their support and of the public in general, being satisfied that one visit to the Woolpack Inn will ensure a second," and then departed Melbourne on the Northumberland in 1853. Bridget had been married to Robert Brown in 1842 in Melbourne, and she had 2 children with Robert Brown, William and Mary. And it mentions that Bridget Brown, her previous husband, Robert Brown, was a man of colour. And it says, "I know Dascombe's stepchildren, a boy and a girl, had a good deal of coloured blood in them." John and Bridget had 4 children between June 1847 and 1852. Only 2 survived infancy, John and James. And John Dascombe was called to the trial, and he said, "I live at Flinders Lane next door to the Woolpack Inn. I know the prisoners at the bar." So in the trial, the prisoner in his defence called Mr J.M. Dascombe, an innkeeper from Melbourne, who stated to the bench that he'd known Clark for 3 years on and off, and that during the last 3 months he'd been engaged on Dascombe's account at the gold diggings at Mount Alexander and always found him to be an honest, hard-working man. He'd lately purchased gold from the prisoner to the amount of £293 and is convinced that he had the means, if he possesses the inclination, to be an honest man. And interestingly, on the 14th of February 1852, it mentions at Mount Alexander that Mr J.M. Dascombe of Melbourne has purchased from Mr Benjamin the largest nugget lately found at Mount Alexander for the sum of £1,322. It weighs 28 pounds, it's pure gold without quartz, and Mr Dascombe is now exhibiting the nugget at the Woolpack Inn in Melbourne at the charge of 1 shilling each. So Dascombe's very much in the money if he can afford to buy a nugget of that price. And an extract of a letter dated from London on the 31st of July 1852. "We had yesterday the honour of a special audience of Her Majesty at the Palace of Osborne to submit Mr Dascombe's large nugget for her inspection, accompanied and presented by Sir John Packington, Colonial Secretary. Both Her Majesty and the Prince Consort were much pleased with the inspection and interested in the subject of Australian gold." So it does mention that Mr Dascombe has departed on the 3rd of October 1852. So it sounds like he wasn't there for the presentation of the nugget to the Queen, to Queen Victoria. And on the 5th of April 1853, challenge Horse Nimrod. "I challenge the owner of Sultan to run my bay gelding for £100 1 week after the present date over the same ground that they ran last January. His challenge to lie open for 8 days from the 1st day of April. Weights 12 stone each. The whole of the money to be put down on the challenge to be accepted. John Milton Dascombe, Woolpack Inn, Queen Street." So he's laying £100 on a rerun of a horse race. So in December 1853, Melbourne, Victoria, the ship Northumberland departed Port Melbourne, and arrival Port London. It had Maria Dascombe, Alan Dascombe, John and Bridget Dascombe with children, James and John Dascombe, and grandmother Joanna Dascombe. And it said that he'd accumulated sufficient savings in the colony to enable him to live comfortably in England. So the rumour was that John Dascombe had profited from the Nelson robbery and left Victoria pretty soon after the robbery with a lot of money and set himself up well in England. The family came back out to Australia in June 1856 on the Ocean Monarch. So it mentioned that John and Bridget Dascombe, with children William Dascombe, and in brackets Brown, 12 years, Mary Dascombe, Brown, 10 years, John Dascombe, 8 years, and James Dascombe, 6 years. John's listed in the 1856 census as a gentleman living in Collins Street. So they weren't in England long and they've returned. However, in March 1857, so less than a year later, the family depart again to return to England. On the 23rd of April 1859, Bridget sails on the ship the Yorkshire, and she's travelling with her daughter, Mary Ann Brown, known on the ship as Mary Dascombe, and she died en route from London to Melbourne on the ship from cardiovascular disease. So Mary arrives in Melbourne in the June, and in the July she departs and turns back around and goes back to London. My theory is that Bridget discovers that John is having a baby with Sarah Fisher because an Alice Maud Dascombe was born in July 1859 in England. And Bridget leaves with her daughter in April 1859, so my suspicion is that she uncovers that Sarah Fisher, who is one of the employees of their home, is actually pregnant to her husband. John's recorded as living with his sons in England in 1861. Sarah Fisher and Alice Fisher are also listed in the household as visitors. Sarah was 22 and John 36 at the time. Even though he has a child with Sarah Fisher, John actually marries Elizabeth Sarah Bond in April 1862 in Kent, England. So he's now 37 and Isabella 27. John then returns to Melbourne in December 1863 with his new wife and John and Bridget's sons and their newborn Isabella. But by August 1864, they again return to England and they have another daughter, Annie, in 1865, who dies at only 8 months old. John returns to England from a trip to Melbourne in January 1867. John's stepson William is living at the Waterloo Hotel in Melbourne in 1868 and he lists his occupation as a civil engineer. And John Dascombe dies of tuberculosis on the 27th of February 1868 at St John's Wood, London. And the executor and recipient of John Dascombe's will is actually his stepson William. So John's property and belongings in Australia were settled on behalf of Solicitor George Ridgett Snowden at Middlesex. So he certainly has developed a lot of funds to be able to go back and forth to Australia and England many times from the time that the robbery occurred. The third man suspected in the robbery was Thomas Quinn. So Thomas Quinn was a man who'd been convicted at the age of 12 for housebreaking and he'd served a sentence at Port Arthur. He was tried but not convicted for the gold robbery. And on the 25th of November 1854, it says capture of the fourth supposed robber. On Thursday the 16th of November, Detective Sergeant Eason and another of the Geelong Police apprehended at the Sir Charles Hotham Hotel, Flinders Street, Melbourne, a middle-aged man calling himself Thomas Quinn, who was accompanied by a woman calling herself his wife and 3 children. He'd come to the hotel on Tuesday and when apprehended there was found with a carpet bag in his room with 3 leather bags, one containing 4,000 ounces of gold dust, another with £540 and 10 shillings, a third with £550 and 10 shillings, all in sovereigns. In another bag were 2 £10 notes from the Bank of Victoria, and in a pocketbook were 5 £20 and 18 £1 notes from the Bank of Victoria, and £195 of notes from the London Chartered Bank. In the pocket of the shooting coat were 10 £10 notes from the Bank of Victoria. In a dressing case were found 2 gold watches, a chain, a purse and a ring, and in another part of the room a silver watch and 3 gold rings. On being brought to the district court, Alfred Abramer, jeweller, identified the 2 diamond rings, which had been bought by the prisoner on Wednesday, for which he paid £51 in notes from the Bank of Victoria. The late accountant of the Bank of Victoria swore to some of the notes found as being part of the stolen property. The prisoner was remanded for 7 days. His wife was also remanded for the same time. And on the 15th of December 1854, recorded in the Age in Melbourne, Thomas Quinn, Thomas Marriott, Patrick Keeley and Edward Seymour were brought upon remand charged with being concerned in the robbery of the Bank of Victoria, Ballarat. Thomas Quinn sworn and examined. I am a mason residing in Geelong. On the Monday week before the robbery, I went to the Ballarat diggings. I called at Mrs. Smith's on the road, which is 3 miles from the diggings. I left my pony there and I went to the prisoner Bolton's tent and found he was not at home. His wife told me so. I then went down in a skittle alley on the gravel pits about a quarter of a mile from the township. The prisoners Bolton and Marriott were in company there. Bolton was playing cards and we were there some time together, after which Bolton, Marriott and myself left the skittle alley and went to the tent of a man named Henry Garrett on the gravel pits. Prisoner Bolton proposed the robbing of the Bank of Victoria, Ballarat. We then agreed to rob the bank on condition that there should be no violence met. And on the Monday, we went to Garrett's tent. Garrett supplied us with blue shirts and hats. One hat was brown billycock, 2 were southwesters, and the others were either gutta percha or India rubber with a peak behind and a peak before. Garrett, Marriott and myself had black crepe in front of the southwesters. Bolton had a piece of white calico with 2 eye holes in it. We then tied up our shirts separately in a handkerchief and these hats. We armed ourselves with 4 pistols. I loaded 3 of the pistols myself with paper, but did not put in powder, bail or shot. Garrett's was loaded in the same way with paper. Prisoner Bolton and myself then left Garrett's tent and went over to Bakery Hill at Ballarat. We went into the bush at the back of the Bank of Victoria and laid down behind some trees. We lay there for some time. It was the middle of the day. I cannot say the time when the prisoner Bolton stood up. Then Garrett and I got up and followed Bolton and Marriott. All 4 of us went to the door of the Bank of Victoria, Ballarat. Garrett was first, I was second, Marriott third and Bolton last. I can't say whether the door of the bank was locked or not. Garrett shoved the door and went in. I followed him. Garrett and myself told Mr. Marshall and Mr. Buckley to stand. Prisoners Bolton and Marriott were in at this time. Garrett secured Buckley and Marriott assisted him. I secured Mr. Marshall. Bolton at this time was on the door inside the bank to see if anyone was coming. After Mr. Buckley was tied, Marriott helped me to tie Mr. Marshall and gag him. I cannot say whether Mr. Buckley was gagged or not. Garrett stood sentry over Mr. Marshall and I stood sentry over Mr. Buckley. Bolton and Marriott tied up the notes and the gold dust that was there. Bolton and Marriott then left the bank together with the notes, the gold and the silver. I then went to the drawer and got in at about 10 or more sovereigns. Garrett and I left the bank and locked Mr. Buckley and Mr. Marshall inside. Garrett and I went together to his tent and were there, I dare say, about half an hour when Marriott brought a handkerchief with the notes. Bolton came in soon after with a handkerchief with the gold dust and notes. We shared out the gold and the gold dust. Garrett had 1 bag, Marriott had another, Bolton had another and I had 2. Garrett then, after he got his share of the notes, went to another tent where he slept. My notes and Bolton's and Marriott's were tied up in 2 handkerchiefs. Marriott and myself remained in the tent for the whole of the time with the property, but the prisoner Bolton went out, I cannot say where. Marriott, Bolton and I left the tent together when it was dark and went to Bolton's, taking with us the whole of the property which came to our 3 shares. Bolton then spoke about some £10 notes that the bank could swear to. He was referring to the bills. Bolton and Marriott then picked out the £10 notes and the £50 notes. After they had done so, they commenced sharing out the notes in 3 shares. I cannot read or write, and so I could not pick them out. We then tied the notes up in separate parcels and put them in handkerchiefs. Bolton and I remained on the diggings until the Friday following of the same week. We bought a cart and harness from a man at Red Hill and borrowed a horse from a man named Smith. Bolton and his wife and I left for Geelong on the Friday morning. We left the cart and horse at Mr. Gosling's at Meredith, and after dinner, Bolton and his wife went on to the conveyance belonging to Mr. Clark. I went on one belonging to Mr. Lascelles after I had given Bolton his handkerchief with the notes in it. Bolton, his wife and I went to Melbourne in the steamer and were put up in the Sir Charles Hotham on the wharf. On the Monday, we went to a gold broker in Melbourne and sold in the gold. On Monday, I went with Bolton to the Chartered Bank, I believe, but I did not go into the bank with him. His wife went in with him. I believe he got a receipt there for a large amount. He also got me a draft for £820. Bolton left his wife at the Imperial, I believe, on the Tuesday, and he and I turned to Geelong and went from there to Ballarat. We went to a man named Abraham. We bought about £86 worth of gold dust and sold it again at a bank, which is the bank nearest to the camp. Bolton mixed some of the notes from the Bank of Victoria, which we had stolen, with those that we got for the gold. After Bolton sold the gold and got the money, we went to the Bank of Victoria, Ballarat. He brought me a cheque of £320. I do not know by whom it was drawn. It was in my name and I got cash for it in Geelong. Bolton and I came home one evening to Mrs. Smith's and found her husband there. He told us to go and looked at our bags, for the children told him that their mother had been to the bags and taken out some notes and that she had run away with a man. I went to the bag and found notes gone. Bolton and I came through Geelong to Melbourne. Bolton brought us £1,500 worth of gold dust. Some dispute arose between Bolton and the man who sold the gold and who was the same that bought the gold from us before. Marriott was present. After the purchase of the gold, I gave to Henry Garrett £400 of the stolen notes, for which Garrett gave me in exchange £400 in notes from other banks, for which we paid £15 per cent. I drew £320 out of the Bank of Victoria. They refused to give it to me until I brought Bolton in with me. I then left Melbourne to go to Geelong and left Marriott in company with Bolton. I believe Garrett was not with them. Before I left, Bolton told me he was going to Sydney or Adelaide and told me to follow him. Marriott gave Bolton a letter, which he read, saying that Grant was going or had gone to Sydney, from there to England. I came to Melbourne and put up at the Sir Charles Hotham. I went to the Imperial to inquire for Marriott. Marriott told me that he was going home in the Overland Mail. I went with him to Collingwood and returned to the Sir Charles Hotham, where I was arrested. I have resided in Geelong for about 8 years. I have a garden there. I never dug up any nuggets there, nor saw any gold dust except my own. It was not more than 9 o'clock on the Monday week before the robbery that I left Geelong. On the evening I arrived at Ballarat, I had neither one watch nor 5 on time. I do not remember the robbery being committed at a jeweller's in Ashby by me, any more than I recollect the Nelson gold being buried in my garden. And it says 5 watches were found on the prisoner at the time of his arrest. I know Port Arthur well, as I was sent there for absconding. I was originally transported for housebreaking. I went back to my cell and then I expressed a wish to see Captain McMahon. I saw Captain McMahon that night and he promised that if I spoke the truth, I would have my liberty and a free passage out of the colony. When I first saw Captain McMahon, he told me that Mrs. Smith had told all about it. I asked him to read over Mrs. Smith's statement, which he did. When I went to Captain McIntosh, he warned me that any statement I might make would be taken down. He also promised faithfully that no person should be hanged for this matter, that I should obtain my liberty, be restored to my children, and alter my position in life. I told him I had no money, that I was thrown upon the streets, and asked him for sufficient money to support me until I could leave the country. He said he would not promise me any money. The statement I made was taken down in writing and signed by me, after which I went back to my cell. Everything I sworn in my examination and cross-examination is the truth. There were no other parties concerned in the robbery besides the 4 I've mentioned. Each of our shares was £3,500. The £3,500 included both gold and notes. To the best of my belief, Mrs. Bolton knew nothing of the robbery. Of the remaining evidence was postponed. The 2 female prisoners, Betty Bolton and Mary Ann Quinn, were then discharged. And then that's all that I hear of Thomas Quinn. So it sounds like he didn't have a very good history. So now we move on to William Smith that was mentioned. And he was also known as Dan Fagan. And it says that when he landed at Larditz Beach, or Sandridge, or Port Melbourne as it's now known, William Smith was utterly destitute. His first exploit was a barefaced robbery perpetrated upon a lemonade dealer who kept a small shop in Swanston Street. A mere accident made him one of the Nelson party. The whole affair was a put-up job. A carpenter, an old hand from Van Diemen's Land, had been working on board the Nelson and knew that the gold had been shipped, and he communicated the fact to a shrewd, determined fellow known as Dan Fagan. This fellow went on board, cleverly disguised, to have a look around, calculated that the thing would be easy to accomplish, and returned to Melbourne. Being an old hand and looked up to by the profession, he in a few hours organised a party of 10 for the enterprise. He allowed none of them to know the exact nature of the business, but told them that he had an undertaking which would pan out to be a couple of $1,000 each. All were to meet at 10 o'clock that night at a house which he named. Fagan's daring and running was so well known that the party agreed to keep the appointment. 8 of the 10 were punctual, the 2 others got drunk and missed their chance. It was necessary to fill their places, and the 2 men chosen were Duncan and Morgan. So Dan Fagan, the leader, according to Suffolk's version, experienced many vicissitudes since he headed the Nelson raid. He was far too cunning a man to waste his share on the booty, yet on that good old ally of the police, information received, Dan was arrested and committed under the name of William Smith and taken to trial for his share of the robbery. There was hardly a shadow of evidence against him, and the jury had to acquit him. On leaving the courthouse, the police endeavoured to arrest him for being illegally at large from Van Diemen's Land. Dan was active and muscular and knocked the first constable down and shook off the second and made a rush through half a dozen others. A quick runner, he'd nearly made good his escape, but horses being handy, he was overtaken by 3 of the police and handcuffed after a terrible struggle. He was, in the course of a few days, returned to Hobart, the Victorian government repaying itself for the expense and trouble attending Mr. Fagan's residence in Melbourne by confiscating £1,100 found upon him when he was first arrested. However, Dan Fagan, or Bill Smith, had great faith in his own destiny, and with 2 others, while awaiting transit to Tasmania, effected his escape on the Hulk, the Lysander. The escape was a remarkable instance of what perseverance, ingenuity and determination can accomplish. The 3 men had to cut through decks and bulkheads, to saw through stout iron bars, and finally, when at length they found an outlet for their bodies, they had to swim a good half-mile to the shore. The day after their escape, naked and exhausted, crouching on the banks of the saltwater river, they were retaken by the water police, placed in heavy irons, and an additional sentence passed upon them. Dan Fagan was eventually returned to Van Diemen's Land, only to escape in a few months when he gave Moreton Bay a turn. Of the end, Mr. Fagan, I do not have a note, but Tasmania was glad to be rid of him. And then Joseph Brady, who was also known as James Brady, James Riley and James Clark, was born in 1825 in Ireland. James Brady was mentioned on the 28th of May 1859. James Brady, 42, 5 foot 6.5 inches, fresh complexion, light brown hair, grey eyes, broad nose, broad chin and scar over left eyebrow. A ticket of leave holder, sentenced to 6 months imprisonment for larceny in Ballarat Jail. Is a convict and previously sentenced for 3 months. In addition, it stated that he was a labourer, a native of Liverpool, but in this record it said he came out on the ship Asia and was free, and is a ticket of leave holder for the Wimmera district. In his jail record, it says that he married Mary O'Reilly and had 2 children with her. On the 7th of November 1870, he received 2 years imprisonment. And the article related to that said, capture of burglars. The Seaham robbery has been cleverly handled and the culprits all bagged. Detective Duncan with Constables Baird and Malloy succeeded on Thursday night in arresting James Byrne, alias O'Reilly, and John Goling upon a charge of having housebreaking implements in their possession. During the forenoon of that day, the detectives sprang a plant of these little implements in the ranges of about 5 miles from Maryborough. To solve this interesting problem, the detective and the 2 constables planted themselves in the bush, and after patiently waiting for some considerable time in their place of concealment, the delinquents above named were seen to come to the spot and carry away the implements. But they hadn't gone far before the detectives were down upon them, and being efficiently assisted by the constables, they were secured after a sharp struggle and conveyed to the lockup at Maryborough. And on Saturday evening, he and the constables succeeded in recovering the whole of the property from the Seaham claim at the Elmer. The gang, for which some time has infested the neighbourhood, is thus effectually broken up. And to show that the offenders are no lambs, it is best necessary to mention that one of them, aged 45, has already spent 24 years of his existence inside stone walls and iron gates. So as a result, James Barnes, alias O'Reilly, and John Gosling were sentenced to 2 years and 6 months for feloniously receiving. On the 14th of July 1874, he was involved in a robbery at Maryborough, and he got a 14-year sentence as a result of that. And the article says, garrotting at Maryborough. The Maryborough Advertiser reports on Monday night that a cab driver named Daniel Minahan was going home when he was suddenly rushed upon by three men: James Brady, alias O'Reilly, John F. Griff and William Lee Howell. One of them, Griff, said, "Hello, is that you?" Instantly another grasped Minahan by the throat and almost choked him, but before the vagabond secured a proper hold of the windpipe, Minahan cried out. In a twinkling, the other two had thrown him upon the ground, whilst the other had hold of his throat. They were in the act of rifling his pockets when someone was heard running to the spot. Griff and Howe decamped. Brady was found and arrested by the constables who heard the cries of Minahan. In about an hour afterwards, Sergeant Fay proceeded to the Bull and Mouth Hotel, who saw and identified Griff and Howe from among the 9 persons who were in the bar at the time. They were arrested and locked up with Brady on a charge of attempted murder and assault. On Tuesday afternoon, they were brought before Mr. Carr and remanded for 8 days. When the police arrived, Minahan was sitting on the ground, trembling and utterly paralysed with fear and horror. On the 7th of March 1876, it says James Brady, alias Burns, alias Riley, Irish, a labourer, 51, 5 foot 4.5 inches tall, 11 stone, fresh complexion, grey hair, blue eyes, large nose, mouth and chin, coarse features, high forehead, clean-shaved, hair on top of head thin, scar on right temple, on top of head and right and left eyebrows, nose broken and inclined to the right, mermaid, JB and MB tattoos inside lower left arm, varicose veins on right leg, prison clothes. Was sentenced to Maryborough for 14 years and 14 concurrent for the robbery in company and robbery under arms on the 14th of July 1874. His wife and 2 children are living in Maryborough. In the Police Gazette in 1876. He's absconded. He actually escaped from Pentridge and was reported to have been employed 2 months ago at Spicer Station, Natto, Barrier Ranges, and assuming the name of James Clark. In August 1881, Joseph Brady, an old prisoner of the Crown who was concerned in the Nelson gold robbery, was remanded for a week for escaping from Pentridge. So he was actually on the run for 5 years. With allowances for good behaviour, it would have expired in January 1883. How he was discovered? Well, on the 12th of August 1881, it says the odds are that James Brady will die in jail. Whilst serving a sentence in Deniliquin, New South Wales, he was recognised as a man who escaped from Pentridge in 1876, when under sentence for 14 years for robbery under arms at Maryborough in 1874, and upon the expiration of his sentence he was forwarded to Melbourne. Brady's quite a celebrity in the criminal world, having received a long sentence for being concerned in the memorable Nelson gold robbery. And on the 12th of August 1881, under police intelligence, the convict James Brady, who was recently arrested by the New South Wales Police at Deniliquin on a warrant charging him with having escaped from legal custody, was brought before Mr. Panton and a bench of magistrates at the City Court on Thursday. James Mathy, the overseer at Pentridge, identified the prisoner as the man described in the warrant, stating he had effected his escape from the stockade on the 29th of February 1876. His escape was not known until the muster roll was called on the evening of the day in question when he was missing. The search was made, but he was nowhere to be found, and a warrant was issued for his apprehension. In reply to an inquiry from the bench as to whether he desired to make any statement, the prisoner said that since he's been at large, he's been respectably conducted and had worked hard to make an honest living. He'd been away 5 years and 5 months, and he thought it was very hard that he should now be punished. Mathy outlined how he escaped. He was told he was doing his usual work within one of the walls of the jail, but nothing was heard of him until muster time. He was not seen until he was arrested in Deniliquin. The day after the prisoner escaped, a proposal was made to fill the drain running into the creek with water, and the witness volunteered to examine the drains, and on going to them he found traces in the mud of a man that had just recently passed through. There had been iron bars in front of the drain previously, but they were found to have been forced out of their permanent position after the prisoner escaped. He stated that the bars were fastened permanently in, but were loose and could easily have been removed. So the supposition was that he had escaped through the drain and he went away and found work. And he was sentenced to 3 months imprisonment cumulative on the 7 years that he had to serve when he escaped. So on the 1st of September 1881, he was reincarcerated. and then he was released on the 13th of August 1888. And William Lewis, who was also mentioned, in 1856, an attempt was made at sea to capture the ship Strebon Heath, which carried a large quantity of specie from Melbourne to London. The plot to seize her was, however, revealed to the captain by one of the leader's associates. This man became so frightened at the dreadful plan of massacre revealed to him that his heart failed him. The ringleader was a tall, determined-looking man named William Lewis. He was tried at the Central Criminal Court in London on the 19th of June 1856 and transported for life. It was asserted by many people that this desperado was the leader of the Nelson affair, and indeed one of his chief arguments to his confederates on board the Strebon Heath was that he'd done this thing before. However, he could not have been involved, as the robbery occurred in 1852, well before he arrived in Australia. So certainly quite a number of men in the underbelly of Melbourne back in the 1880s. And it was interesting how many years later there were men popping up and being linked to the Nelson robbery.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.